When did people begin to write?
If writing is viewed as a means of communicating between humans, using conventional visible marks, then writing spans the entire history of visual communication from early pictographic picture writing, beginnings to alphabetical writing. The oldest picture writing identified thus far was found in Mesopotamia. Present-day Iraq, the valley between the lower Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This writing, called cuneiform, dates back to the last centuries of the 4th millennium BC. c. 3700 BC. The finding consisted of about a dozen pictures inscribed on both sides of a limestone tablet. The characters are made up of wedge-shaped strokes. The system was probably created by the Sumerians, a non-Semitic people whose origins are unknown. They probably immigrated to Southwest Asia, Mesopotamia, from the east. Cuneiform pictographs closely resemble Egyptian hieroglyphics. Picture script developed by ancient Egyptian priests and perfected by the first Egyptian dynasty. 3110 to 2884 BC. Egyptian hieroglyphics consisted of some 600 symbols, phonograms. Cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems were the predecessors to the alphabet.
What were bonanza farms?
Bonanza farms were extremely successful and large farms, principally on the Great Plains and in the West, that emerged during the second half of the 1800s. The word bonanza, which is derived from Spanish and means literally good weather, was coined in the mid-1800s. It is used to refer to any source of great and sudden wealth, including mines rich in minerals. Large-scale farming had been aided by the development of machinery that greatly increased production, especially of wheat and other grains. The innovations included reapers invented by Cyrus Hall McCormick, 1809 to 1884, and steel plows developed by John Deere, 1804 to 1886. Several events further helped farming interests west of the Mississippi River. To promote westward settlement, Congress passed the Homestead Act, 1862, which allowed for ready and cheap acquisition of vast tracts of land. Settlers could buy land for as little as $1.25 per acre, or they could live on a tract and farm it for a period of 5 years, at the end of which they were granted 160 acres. The U.S. Army's defeats of rebel Indians were followed by peace treaties that confined Indian agricultural activities to reservations. In 1872, the Northern Pacific Railroad arrived at Fargo, North Dakota, allowing farmers to ship their products greater distances. Finally, dry farming techniques, which allow fields to lie fallow every other year in order to regain their nutrients and moisture to support crops the following year, proved to be a successful method for growing in the Great Plains, previously thought to be too dry for cultivating crops. All of these factors combined to turn some western farms into bonanzas, sources of great wealth for their owners. Encouraged by their success, settlers poured into the West. But not all farmers fared as well. And many were severely hit by the Panic of 1873. A drought in the plains. States in the 1880s caused farm prices to drop, further hurting Western farmers.
What was the worst industrial accident?
It was the gas leak at a Union Carbide chemical plant in Bhopal, India, on December 3, 1984. At about 12:30 a.m., methyl isocyanate, MIC, a deadly gas, began escaping from the pesticide plant. And it spread southward, eventually covering approximately 15 square miles. Within a few hours, thousands of Bhopal residents were affected by the asphyxiating gas. General symptoms included severe chest congestion, vomiting, paralysis, sore throat, chills, coma, fever, swelling of legs, impaired vision, and palpitations. Estimates of the total death toll range from the official government estimate between 3,000 and 10,000. A figure based on what medical professionals described. In total, 200,000 people were directly or indirectly affected by the poisonous gas. Within hours of the accident, Bhopal police moved into action, closing the plant and arresting its manager and 4 of his assistants. The 5 men were charged with culpable homicide through negligence. Union Carbide dispatched a team of technical experts from its Danbury, Connecticut headquarters, but upon arrival at the plant, they were turned away by local authorities. Meanwhile, the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation seized the plant's records and logbooks and ordered an inquiry into the accident. Union Carbide's Chief Executive Officer Warren M. Anderson flew to Bhopal, but he was promptly arrested, along with 2 officials of the company's Indian subsidiary. The corporate executives were charged with 7 offenses including criminal conspiracy, culpable homicide not amounting to murder, making the atmosphere noxious to health, and causing death by negligence. Anderson was later released on bond. Upon learning of the horrific accident, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, sent a message conveying the grief shared by him and the American people. Multinational corporations, including Union Carbide, were vilified in the press. The Soviet news agency accused such companies of marketing low-quality products and outdated technology to developing countries. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, 1944 to 1991, of India visited the disaster site and announced immediate creation of a $4 million relief fund for victims. He also vowed that he would prevent multinational corporations from setting up dangerous factories in India. The implications of the industrial accident were many. It prompted public scrutiny of safety systems at chemical plants around the globe. given the number of plants where poisonous chemicals are produced and stored. Some observers believe chemical accidents could happen as often as once in every 10 years. Union Carbide, of course, suffered financially. The stock dropped more than 12 points, wiping out 27%, or almost $1 billion, of its market value, in about 1 week. Damage claims were filed in behalf of the victims, with noted American criminal attorney Melvin Belli filing one of them in the amount of $15 billion. In addition to the thousands who died in Bhopal, others suffered from long-term effects including chronic lesions of the eyes, permanent scarring of the lungs, and injuries to the liver, brain, heart, kidneys, and the immune system. In the years after the accident, studies showed that the rate of spontaneous abortions and infant deaths in Bhopal were 3 to 4 times the regional rate.
When was Hollywood's golden age?
Hollywood had its heyday in the 1930s, in the same decade that the Great Depression crippled the world economy. The American film industry enjoyed its golden age. The era was marked by technical innovations. Talking movies had made their debut in 1927 with the first full-length film with sound, The Jazz Singer, and by 1932 all films were talkies. The first Technicolor film, Becky Sharp, debuted in 1935, and by 1939 was perfected when Gone with the Wind was released. And special effects were brought to the screen in 1933 with King Kong, which was the result of painstaking stop-motion and rear projection photography. In the meantime, movie stars such as Clark Gable, Claudette Colbert, Greta Garbo, and the Marx Brothers achieved public followings that were the envy of political and business leaders. The MGM, Warner Brothers, and RKO Studios led Hollywood production, but other studios, including Fox, Paramount, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, also fared well during these difficult times. In 1939 Hollywood had what has often been called its greatest year. Among the top releases that year were the classics Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Stagecoach, Ninotchka, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gunga Din. By the end of the decade Hollywood had become a major contributor to popular culture, an occasional contributor to high culture, and a dynamic, if unsteady, force in the nation's economy.
Mainland attacked during World War II?
Yes, the continental United States was hit twice during the war, but with no casualties and only minimal damage. The first attack occurred at approximately 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942, when a Japanese submarine shelled an oil storage field at Elwood Beach, California, about 12 miles north of Santa Barbara. The Japanese were trying to hit oil tanks there, evidently with the intent of producing a spectacular explosion. But after firing a reported 16 or 17 rounds, they had struck only a pier. Most of the shells fell into the sea, well short of their targets. U.S. planes gave chase, but the submarine got away. There were no injuries and only minimal damage. But the event put the nation on heightened alert to the possibility of more attacks. The February 23 attack took place shortly after President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, had begun his fireside chat, addressing the nation over the radio. He talked about how this war was different, since it was being waged on every continent. Every island, every sea, every air lane in the world. He also said, the broad oceans which have been heralded in the past as our protection from attack have become endless battlefields on which we are constantly being challenged by our enemies. The unsuccessful assault at Elwood was the first attack on mainland U.S. soil since the War of 1812-14. The event stirred fears of conspiracy and rattled nerves up and down the West Coast. There was one other strike on mainland soil during World War II, at Fort Stevens, Oregon, at the mouth of the Columbia River. On the evening of June 21, 1942, a Japanese submarine fired some 17 rounds of shells at the coastal military installation but caused no damage.
Why did some observers draw comparisons between the war in Iraq and the Vietnam War?
Critics of the U.S.-led war in Iraq found several similarities to American military involvement in Vietnam. Both conflicts seemed to many people to be without ample cause. Critics of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq charged that there was no compelling reason for Americans to go to war in the Middle Eastern nation. They called the operation hawkish, saying it was an unwarranted expansion of the war on terror. These arguments were strengthened when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Media images of protests against the invasion of Iraq harkened back to the anti-war demonstrations of the Vietnam era. And, like Vietnam, there seemed to be no clear exit strategy for the U.S. military from Iraq. These were extended operations, or wars without end. Some observers also drew comparisons between Vietnam's My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq. They pointed to military spokespersons who categorized the atrocities as isolated events, unrepresentative of American military policy. The Bush administration stood by the decision to enter Iraq, ousting and capturing Saddam Hussein, 1937. Saying it was a rogue state led by a despotic ruler who had the capability of aiding terrorist groups. The controversy over Iraq continued long after President George W. Bush, 1946, declared the end to major combat operations, as the casualty count climbed, the result of continued coalition fighting against pockets of resistance and attacks on U.S. installments in the unstable Nation. In 2005, as U.S. officials slowly handed over security to Iraqi forces. There was not yet a timetable for U.S. withdrawal. But the newly elected interim president, Kurdish leader Jalal Talabani, vowed that his government would work to provide security so that U.S.-led coalition forces could return home.
Who was Enrico Fermi?
The Italian-born physicist Enrico Fermi, 1901–1954, was one of the chief architects of the nuclear age. In 1934 Fermi announced that he had discovered elements beyond uranium. But what he had really done, and which was later proved, was split the atom. In 1938, just before World War II, 1939–45, this process was named nuclear fission. And 1 year later, German-born physicist Albert Einstein, 1879–1955, would write a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, urging the American government to study this process, which releases energy. Also in 1938 Fermi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics and he escaped Italy, where the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, 1883–1945, had taken hold. Fermi became a professor of physics at Columbia University in 1939, where he taught for 3 years. In 1942 he got involved in the Manhattan Project, which was developing the atomic bomb. In that capacity, he directed the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. After World War II, Fermi, who had become an American citizen in 1944, taught at the University of Chicago and continued his research on the basic properties of nuclear particles. In 1953 he had an element named after him, fermium, an artificially created radioactive element. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, honors accomplishments in physics with the Enrico Fermi Award.
How was the Byzantine Empire formed?
The Byzantine Empire was a continuation of the Roman Empire. Its citizens even called themselves Romans. 2 dates are given for the formation of the Byzantine Empire, which, though boundaries shifted constantly, was centered in Asia Minor and the Balkan Peninsula, in AD 395, upon the death of Emperor Theodosius the Great. The Roman Empire was divided into 2, East and West. In the years that followed, the West Roman Empire was subject to repeated attacks from nomadic barbarian groups, and Rome finally fell in 476. The East Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire, which, after the fall of Rome, laid claim to much of the lands in the West. However, many historians date the beginning of the Byzantine Empire earlier at AD 330, when Roman Emperor Constantine the Great moved the capital of the then united Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, subsequently known as Constantinople. By this definition of the empire, Constantine the Great was its first ruler. He was succeeded by nearly 100 rulers over the course of more than 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. At its height, during the 6th century reign of Justinian I from 483 to 565, the empire included parts of southern and eastern Europe, northern Africa, and the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire ended when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453.
When did football begin?
In ancient Greece and Rome, a game was played in which the object was to move a ball across a goal line by throwing, kicking, or running with it. Several modern games were derived from this, including rugby and soccer, from which American football directly evolved. In much of the world, football refers to soccer, in which players are allowed to advance the ball only with their feet or heads. Historians generally agree that the first game of American football was played on November 6, 1869, in New Brunswick, New Jersey, when Rutgers defeated the College of New Jersey, present-day Princeton University, 6-4. They played on a field 120 yards long and 75 yards wide and used a round, soccer-like ball. Other Eastern colleges, including Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, soon added the sport to their athletic programs. In 1876, a set of official rules were compiled. In the 1880s, Yale coach Walter Camp, 1859 to 1925, revised the rules, giving the world the game played today. He limited teams to 11 players, established the scrimmage system for putting the ball into play, introduced the concept of requiring a team to advance the ball a certain number of yards within a given number of downs, and came up with the idea of marking the field with yard lines.
When was modern Israel established?
As a modern state, Israel was formed by decree in 1948. In the wake of World War II, 1939-45. The United Nations, UN, formed a special committee to address the British control of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. The narrow piece of land comes to a point in the south, where it fronts the Gulf of Aqaba. In November 1947, the United Nations, UN, carved Israel out of the Palestine region. Areas of Palestine that were not designated as Israel were divided between neighboring Arab countries. Modern Israel's first leader, David Ben-Gurion, 1886 to 1973, proclaimed an independent Israel on May 14, 1948. Born in Poland, Ben-Gurion had arrived in Palestine as a young man of about 20 and became extremely active in efforts to assert Jewish autonomy in the region. He served as Prime Minister from 1949 to 1953 and again between 1955 and 1963. But Israel's history goes back much farther than these 20th century events. And, having such a long history, it is also a complicated one. Israel was an ancient kingdom in Palestine, formed under King Saul in 1020 BC. Israel included the lands in Canaan, the promised land of the Hebrew tribes who descended from the people that Moses 14th–13th century BC led out of Egypt. But the kingdom was subsequently divided, and by the 8th century BC it had ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the area remained home and holy land to the Hebrews, Israelites, who had settled there. The entire region of Palestine, including the Kingdom of Israel, subsequently came under the control of various empires. Palestine saw the rule of the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, the Macedonians under Macedonian King Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC. And the Romans. The area was the Roman province of Syria in the time of Jesus. After Roman rule, Palestine was, with only one exception, ruled by various Muslim Islamic dynasties, including the Ottoman Empire, 1516 to 1917. It was in 1917 that Palestine came under control of the British, who proclaimed in the Declaration of Balfour to support the establishment of a national home for the Jews living there. However, Britain reversed this policy in 1939. At the same time, the area was seeing an influx of Jewish people who were escaping persecution in Europe. Jews in Palestine opposed British control, and at the same time fighting intensified between Jews and Arabs. The 1947 decision by the Union to establish a Jewish homeland resulted in nearly 2 years of fighting between Israelis and Arabs in the region. And though boundaries among the various states were determined anew in 1949, fighting in the region continued with the Arab-Israeli wars of 1956, 1967, 1973–74, and 1982. Unrest prevailed throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, when the two sides began discussions to resolve the long conflict.
Was the Mayan Empire the most advanced early civilization?
In some regards, the Mayas were more advanced than other civilizations. Their development preceded that of the other agrarian civilizations in North and South America, principally the Aztec and the Inca. The Mayas were an agricultural people who in about 1000 BC settled in southern Mexico and Central America. Their territory covered Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, much of Guatemala, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. They developed a civilization that was highly advanced. Not only did the Mayas produce remarkable architecture, including flat-topped pyramids, temples, and towers that are still visited by tourists today, and art, including sculpture, painting, and murals. but they developed their own writing system, probably the first in the Western Hemisphere. They used this system to record time, astronomical events, their history, and religion. They believed in more than 160 gods. They also developed an advanced mathematics as well as a 365-day calendar, believed by some to be even more accurate than the Gregorian calendar in use today. At its peak, the Mayan population numbered some 14 million. Their history is divided into three periods. The pre-classic period began about the time they originated, roughly 1000 BC, and extended into AD 300, this was the group's formative period. During the classic period, 300 to 900, Mayan culture spread throughout the area and city centers were developed at Copan, Honduras, Palenque, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza, Mexico, and Piedras Negras, Yucaxtlan, and Tikal, Guatemala. Scholars believe that Tikal was home to some 50,000 people and was not only a center for government, education, economics, and science, but was also a spiritual mecca for the Maya. It was in the second half of the classic period that the Maya made their greatest accomplishments in art and science. Europe would not produce a superior system of mathematics for centuries to come. During the post-classic period, 900-1546, they were invaded by the Toltecs. However, the Maya absorbed these people rather than being conquered by them. Nevertheless, by the time the Spaniards arrived in the mid-1500s, the Mayan civilization was in decline. Some historians attribute this to widespread famine or disease, while others believe the decline was due to a rebellion of the people against the harsh government. Though they were conquered by the Spaniards and became assimilated into the larger culture that developed in the region, Maya Indians still survive in Mexico and Central America today.
What was the oath of the tennis court?
It was the oath taken in June 1789 by a group of representatives of France's Third Estate who, having been rejected by King Louis XVI, 1754 to 1793, and the First and the Second Estates, vowed to form a French National Assembly and write their own constitution. The pledge set off a string of events that began the French Revolution, 1789–99. French society had long been divided into three classes, called estates. Members of the clergy were the first estate, nobles comprised the second, and everyone else made up the third. When philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, came along and challenged the king's supreme authority by promoting the idea that the right to rule came not from God but from the people, it fueled the discontent felt by the long-suffering peasants and the prosperous middle class who paid most of the taxes to run the government but who had no voice in it. In short, these people were the disenfranchised Third Estate. A government financial crisis brought on by the expense of war forced King Louis XVI to reluctantly Call a meeting of the representatives of all three estates, called the Estates General, which had last convened in 1614. During the May 5, 1789, meeting at Versailles, the Third Estate attempted to seize power from the nobility, the clergy, and the king by insisting that the three estates be combined to form a national assembly in which each member had one vote. Since the Third Estate had as many representatives as the other two combined, the people would at last have a voice. When the attempt failed, the representatives of the Third Estate gathered on a Versailles tennis court, where they vowed to change the government. Louis XVI began assembling troops to break up the meeting. Meantime, an armed resistance movement had begun to organize. The situation came to a head on July 14, 1789, with the storming of the Bastille in Paris.
Why does the music of Bartók figure prominently in concert programs today?
Béla Bartók, 1881–1945, is revered today not only for his ability as a pianist. His teacher compared him to Franz Liszt (1811–1886), who was perhaps the greatest pianist of the 19th century. But for his compositions, which are steeped in the tradition of Hungarian folk music. Bartók studied and analyzed Hungarian, Romanian, and Arabian folk tunes, publishing thousands of collections of them in his lifetime. While ethnic music had influenced the works of other composers, Bartók was the first to make it an integral part of art music composition. His works were unique in that the folk music provided the sheer essence and substance of the music, lending the compositions a primitive quality. Among his masterpieces are his three stage works, the ballets The Wooden Prince and The Miraculous Mandarin, and the one-act opera Duke Bluebeard's Castle. The introduction of folk music as the core of a musical composition has had far-reaching influence, which must have been felt by American composer Aaron Copland, 1900–1990. Whose Appalachian Spring, 1944, features a simple shaker tune, front and center.
Who were the Vikings?
The Vikings, also called Norsemen, were fierce, seafaring warriors who originated in Scandinavia. Beginning in the late 700s, they raided England, France, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Italy, Russia, and Spain. Great shipbuilders, the Vikings also reached Greenland, Iceland, and probably even North America long before the Europeans. Ruins of a Norse settlement were found on the northeastern coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The Vikings were converted to Christianity during the 10th and 11th centuries, about the same time that the kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were established. Under the Danish leader Canute, Vikings conquered England in 1016 and ruled it as part of Denmark until 1042.
Who was Confucius and who do people still quote him?
Confucius, 551 to 479 B. C. was a Chinese philosopher whose real name was Keung Chiu. Confucius is the Latinized version. Born into a class of lesser nobility in the province of Lu. His father died before Confucius had turned 3 and he was raised in humble circumstances by his mother. He lived in the middle of China's feudal period, when there were enormous problems, including famine and poverty, which had been brought on by weak emperors and, consequently, chronic warfare among rival feudal states. Because of his upbringing, Confucius possessed a profound sympathy for the common people. In his view, the feudal princes, only interested in their own personal gain, were responsible for the suffering of the people. Confucius set out on a reform mission, believing that good government can only be achieved by ethical leaders. Confucius endeavored to train a new generation of them. He taught literature and music, important in building character, conduct, and, most importantly, ethics, to anyone who wanted to learn. He is regarded as the first Chinese teacher to offer education freely. That is to say, to all comers, rather than just the privileged. The great philosopher is revered for his belief that the family is the model for all human relations. Confucianism regards the chief relations in life to be those between ruler and subject, father and son, elder and younger brother, husband and wife, and friends. Most importantly, he taught students that rulers are responsible for the happiness of their subjects. He believed that government leaders need not be expert administrators. Instead, they must be humane, honest, and above corruption and personal gain. Some of his students went on to hold positions of power in city governments. Over the centuries, he became the most venerated person in Chinese history. But his teachings transcend cultural lines, which is why Confucian wisdom, including the principle what you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others, is often quoted. The philosophy's maxims are set forth in the work Lunyu, Analects, recorded by his followers. Except for his time spent in military service, Socrates lived his entire life in Athens, where he was as well known for his disheveled appearance as for his moral integrity, self-control, and quest for wisdom. He lived during a time when attention was turning away from the physical world of the heavens, and toward the human world, of the self, the community, and the law. He participated in this turning point by walking the streets of Athens, engaging people including rulers who were supposed to be wiser than he in conversation. In these conversations, he employed what came to be known as the Socratic method or dialectic, a series of seemingly simple questions designed to elicit a rational response. Through the line of questioning, which usually centered around a moral concept such as courage, the person being questioned was intended to realize that he did not truly know that which he thought he knew. Socrates' theory was that once the person being questioned realized his weak understanding, he could divest himself of false notions, and was then free to participate in the quest for knowledge. These philosophical disputes, however, gained Socrates many enemies. Though he left no writings, Socrates' student, Plato, documented his recollections of dialogues with his teacher. A staunch believer in self-examination and self-knowledge, Socrates is credited with saying that the unexamined life is not worth living. Some ascribe the quote to Plato. Socrates also believed that the psyche, or inner self, is what should give direction to one's life, not appetite or passions. A seminal figure in Greek, and Western, thought, philosophy that predates him is termed pre-Socratic.
How old is the concept of public schools?
It dates at least as far back as ancient China. The philosopher Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, was among the first in China to advocate that primary school education should be available to all. He averred that in education there should be no class distinctions. He never refused a student, even though he came to me on foot, with nothing more to offer as tuition than a package of dried meat. Confucius asserted that any man, including a peasant boy, had the potential to be a man of principle. However, it was not until the Age of Enlightenment that public schools were widely instituted. In Prussia, present-day Germany, Frederick the Great, 1712 to 1786, was considered an enlightened ruler for, among other things, founding a public education system, which became established during the early 1800s. After Prussia united with Germany to form a powerful state, other European countries began instituting systems of public education which were credited by many as an important factor in Prussia's rise. By the early 20th century, public elementary schooling was both free and compulsory in most of Europe. Free secondary education was also offered in some nations. In the United States, public schools had their beginnings during colonial times. In 1647, Massachusetts passed a law requiring the establishment of public schools.
What is the Sherman Antitrust Act?
Passed by Congress in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was an attempt to break up corporate trusts. Combinations of firms or corporations formed to limit competition and monopolize a market. The legislation stated that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade is illegal. While the act made clear that anyone found to be in violation of restraining trade would face fines, jail terms, and the payment of damages, the language lacked clear definitions of what exactly constituted restraint of trade. the nation's courts were left with the responsibility of interpreting the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the justices proved as reluctant to take on big business as Congress had been. The legislation was introduced in Congress by Senator John Sherman, 1823-1900, of Ohio. In response to increasing outcry from state governments and the public for the passage of national antitrust laws. Many states had passed their own antitrust bills or had made constitutional provisions prohibiting trusts. But the statutes proved difficult to enforce and big business found ways around them. When the legislation proposed by Sherman reached the Senate, conservative congressmen rewrote it. Many charged that the senators had made it deliberately vague. In the decade after its passage, the federal government prosecuted only 18 antitrust cases, and court decisions did little to break up monopolies. But after the turn of the century, a progressive spirit in the nation grew. Among progressive reformers' demands was that government regulate business. In 1911 the U.S. Justice Department won key victories against monopolies, breaking up John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and James B. Duke's American Tobacco Company. The decisions set a precedent for how the Sherman Antitrust Act would be enforced and demonstrated a national intolerance toward monopolistic trade practices. In 1914, national antitrust legislation was strengthened by the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which outlawed price fixing, the practice of pricing below cost to eliminate a competitive product, made it illegal for the same executives to manage two or more competing companies, a practice called interlocking directorates, and prohibited any corporation from owning stock in a competing corporation. The creation of the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, that same year provided further insurance that U.S. corporations engaging in unfair practices would be investigated by the government. Between 1880 and the early 1900s, corporate trusts proliferated in the United States, becoming powerful business forces. The vague language of the Sherman antitrust legislation and the court's reluctance to prosecute big business based on that act did little to break up the monopolistic giants. The tide turned against corporate trusts when Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became president in September 1901, after President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, was assassinated. Roosevelt launched a trust-busting campaign, initiating, through the Attorney General's office, some 40 lawsuits against American corporations such as American Tobacco Company, Standard Oil Company, and American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. Government efforts to break up the monopolies were strengthened in 1914, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. 1856 to 1924, when Congress passed the Clayton antitrust legislation and created the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, which is responsible for keeping business competition free and fair. Trust busting declined during the prosperity of the 1920s, but was again vigorously pursued in the 1930s. During the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945.
Which states were the original 13?
In order of admission they are Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. Vermont was 14th and the first free state, the first state without slavery.
What was the impact of the 100 Years' War?
After waging war with each other for more than a century. In 1453, both England and France emerged as stronger, centralized governments. As the governments had gained strength, the nobility in both countries found themselves with less power and influence than they had enjoyed previously, and the system of feudalism, which before the war had been necessary in the absence of a larger, protective entity, was on the decline. In their strategies against each other, both countries had developed new military tactics. And though England had fewer resources than did France, it still managed to assert itself at sea, marking the beginning of that country's naval prowess.
When was color television invented?
In 1940, Hungarian-American engineer Peter Karl Goldmark, 1906 to 1977. The head of the Columbia Broadcasting Systems, CBS, Research and Development Laboratory, came up with a technology that broke down the television image into three primary colors through a set of spinning filters in front of black and white, causing the video to be viewed in color. His system gave way in the 1950s to an RCA system whose signals were compatible with conventional black and white TV signals. In September 1962, American Broadcasting Corporation, ABC, began color telecasts, for 3.5 hours a week. By this time, competitor National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, was broadcasting 68% of its primetime programming in color, while CBS had opted to confine itself to black and white after having transmitted in color earlier. By 1967, all three networks were broadcasting entirely in color. It was not until 1967 that color television was broadcast in England. On July 1, the BBC Two transmitted 7 hours of programming, most of it coverage of lawn tennis from Wimbledon.
What impact have VCRs and digital recorders had on television viewing?
Since VCRs, invented 1975, and the more recent digital recorders such as TiVo give viewers the ability to record television programs and watch them when they choose, a phenomenon known as time shifting has emerged. As Americans watch previously recorded programming, they miss primetime broadcasts. Commentators mused that Americans were losing a sense of community. Gone were the days when office workers would stand around the water cooler to chat about last night's episode of a popular program. Since these recording devices also gave viewers the ability to fast forward through commercials, a practice dubbed zapping, they posed challenges to the advertising industry.
What is the strongest earthquake recorded in an urban area?
T is believed to be a November 1, 1755, earthquake that struck Lisbon, Portugal. The quake may have registered at least 9.0 on the Richter scale and lasted 6 or 7 minutes. The port city was demolished, and more than 60,000 people perished. It was felt as far away as Sweden and generated a giant wave. Tsunami, that struck the West Indies in the Caribbean Ocean. The catastrophe in Lisbon generated an intense debate among European philosophers who tried to explain why God destroyed that particular city. Then the seat of the Holy Inquisition, during High Mass on All Saints' Day.
Which U.S. president held the first press conference?
President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924. Was the first president to routinely assemble the press to answer questions for the public. On March 15, 1913, shortly after his inauguration, he called the first presidential press conference. More than 100 news reporters attended the event. Decades later, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, became known for his frequent use of the televised press conference to directly communicate with Americans.
What was the controversy about the Guantanamo detainees?
After the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. military began holding terror suspects at a detention center at the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The U.S. Navy has occupied Guantanamo since the Spanish-American War. In 1898, paying an annual lease to Cuba. The White House labeled the detainees enemy combatants. The controversy came when they were not charged with any crimes, yet they continued to be held. The first detainees were transported to Guantanamo, or Camp Gitmo, in January 2002, after being captured in Afghanistan. But no charges were made against any detainees until more than 2 years later. In February 2004, American lawyers challenged the Bush administration policy at Guantanamo, saying that it was a violation of the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. In January 2005, one district court judge agreed with the prosecution, saying that the Constitution applied to the prisoners. They could not be deprived of their liberty without due process of the law. the Bush administration immediately moved to appeal the ruling. Some in the international community also strongly criticized the U.S. government for holding the suspects. One of Britain's most senior judges called the policy a monstrous failure of justice. In response to the widespread criticism, the U.S. Defense Department considered making major changes to the tribunals set up to prosecute terror suspects at Guantanamo. The changes were to bring the tribunals in line with the judicial standards of U.S. court-martials. But questions also arose about the treatment of the detainees and the methods used in interrogating them. Human rights groups made charges of abuses. In spring 2005, United Nations officials working in the area of war crimes were awaiting a visit to Guantanamo. The hold-up was that they requested full access to the facilities and the prison population, conditions Washington was reluctant to allow. According to a February 2005 American Forces Information Service report, there were about 545 people from some 40 countries being held at the Guantanamo Detention Center at that time. The government also held terror suspects, some of them senior members of the terrorist network Al-Qaeda. In Navy brigs in South Carolina, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and on Navy vessels at sea.
Why was President Clinton impeached?
Some believe the proceedings were nothing more than a vast right-wing conspiracy. A term coined by First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, 1947, early in 1998. Still, others including enough members of the U.S. House of Representatives to bring 11 counts of impeachment against President Clinton. In December 1998 felt the nation's chief had perjured himself and obstructed justice. Many also believed he had jeopardized the authority of the U.S. presidency. Accused of having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, President Clinton vehemently denied it. Upon continued investigation, conducted by Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr's office, the allegations proved to be true. Since the president had been so adamant in his statements to the contrary, evidence began to accumulate that he had lied about his relationship with the young woman and that he had tried to cover up the matter. Many believed the charges against Clinton did not constitute the high crimes and misdemeanors called for by the U.S. Constitution to remove a president from office. Nevertheless, in January 1999 the U.S. Senate organized itself to hear the charges against the president. When the trial concluded in February, Clinton was acquitted of both perjury and obstruction of justice. He served out his second term and left office with high approval ratings. Despite being the subject of the longest criminal investigation of a president in history, the Clinton impeachment was the first time the federal legislature had convened itself as a court in more than 130 years since the impeachment hearings of President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, in 1868.
Why is Gutenberg considered the pioneer of modern printing?
Johannes Gutenberg, c. 1390 to 1468, a German who built his first printing press around 1440 to 1450. Is considered the inventor of a lasting system of movable type printing. Printing technology had only a brief existence in Europe before Gutenberg, whose process, culminating in the publication of the Gutenberg Bible, 1452 to 1456, made printed material available to everyone, not just the clergy or the privileged class. Gutenberg is credited with helping spread the ideals of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, throughout Europe.
What does Wagnerian mean?
It is a reference to anything that is in the style of German composer Richard Wagner, 1813 to 1883. Wagner was an enormously creative composer, conductor, and artistic manager who is credited with no less than originating the music drama. His interest in theater began in his boyhood, and by his teens he was writing plays. So that he could put music to these works, he sought out composition teachers. It is no surprise then that Wagner later conceived of the idea of the total work of art, where music, poetry, and the visual arts are brought together in one stunning performance piece. As an adult, Wagner led a scandalous life, even today challenging the music-listening public to separate his life from his art. He was someone modern audiences would recognize as a truly gifted and charismatic, if amoral, artist, working on a grand scale. Were he alive now, Wagner might well be creating blockbusters. In fact, his musical compositions are heard in movies, including Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, and are familiar to even the youngest audience today, or at least those who watch Bugs Bunny cartoons. But this is not to take away from Wagner's serious accomplishments. His most widely recognized operatic works include Lohengrin, 1848, The Ring Cycle, 1848-74, and Tristan und Isolde, 1859. In the decades after his death, Wagner's reputation grew to the point that through the end of the 19th century his influence was felt by most every composer, who often referred to Wagner's works in measuring the value of their own.